Two more coming, but it's noon, so let's get started. I have the pleasure of introducing Nikos Zirogiannis, who is a colleague familiar to this table, usually here on Mondays with the rest of us. And Nikos is a scientist in SPIA, and his collaboration on this paper is with, I think, two other colleagues from SPIA. Daniel, I know, is in SPIA, and Alex, is that you? And so one of the co-authors is here today. And we're gonna, so since Nikos is a familiar colleague around the table, he understands the 5-minute rule. So he's gonna present this work, and then the rest of us who had a chance to see this paper will get to ask questions, and I'll try to keep the queue. So, without further ado, I'll turn it over.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, folks, for coming. I appreciate you taking the time to look over the paper. As Bill said, I want to acknowledge my co-author, Alex Hollingsworth from SPIA, who's here. Daniel Simon also said he should be able to make it. So this is a paper we've been working on for a couple of years now, and it's sort of an example of a research effort where political reality has sort of caught up with us, interfered a little bit with our motivation, and not really the motivation, but our plan on how to pitch the paper, if you will. So just to give you a sense of where we are, this is a map of the states that are part of the lawsuit that's currently pending for the Clean Power Plan. So the DC Circuit Court heard arguments in September. The plan is that sometime soon we'll hear a decision, and supposedly losers or winners of the case will move it up to the Supreme Court. But irrespective of what's going to happen with the Clean Power Plan, the approach we want to take in this paper is that we're using the Clean Power Plan more as a motivation, with the actual focus of the paper being an alternative methodology for estimating the benefits from co-pollutant reductions from a carbon policy. And just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, right? What is the importance of this research effort? So these are the projected benefits from the Clean Power Plan from reductions of CO2 emissions and co-pollutants. And you will notice that the co-benefits, so these are the health benefits from reducing primarily sulfur dioxide emissions and nitrous oxides. These are just as big, if not higher, than the climate benefits from the reductions of CO2. And these are benefits assessed by applying the social cost of carbon, right? So this is where we are in this paper, right? So we're saying, let's try to take an alternative approach, an empirical approach that does not rely on those engineering bottom-up models like the integrated planning model that the EPA uses. Let's try to see if we can arrive at estimating co-pollutant benefits using an empirical approach. And one of the benefits of this approach is that we can sort of incorporate the uncertainty around those reductions, right? So the estimates from the EPA are for the most part point estimates from simulations from the IPM. The approach we are taking allows us to put a bound our point estimates. That's something that we didn't have time to include in the paper, but we're planning to add as we go along. The health part, the estimation of the health benefits is also something new that we've started exploring, along with the different approaches that we briefly discussed in the last section of how to distribute output reductions among the various power plants. The case of CO2 is unique in the sense that mitigation approaches for CO2 reductions are very limited. Like if we set aside carbon capture and sequestration, which currently doesn't seem to play a very big role, at least based on the projections that the EPA has done, the only other mechanisms for reducing CO2 are reducing output from coal-fired power plants and moving to lower carbon options like natural gas and renewables. So this is the unique sort of characteristic of CO2 that allows us to work with the approach that we're currently taking in this paper. And the other argument we want to make is that this same approach can be used for other types of policies targeting carbon reductions, like a cap and trade or a carbon tax, and try to get estimates of co-pollutant reductions, which are, as you see, non-trivial. I'm going to leave it at that and yield the floor for questions, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what people thought about the paper.
And as I said, I'll maintain the queue, and the queue is open, and I'll take the prerogative of asking a question first, and that is there any reason to believe that, this is, I think, relevant for an empirically crafted approach to estimation, is there any reason to believe that already achieved, like SO2 reductions, for example, then have an impact on the future trajectory of SO2 reductions? Is this just a nice line going down, or is this a curve that flattens out at some point because the easy stuff's already been done? So.
Bill, you've summarized in your question what keeps me up at night.
Do you want to save that one for later then? And we'll do other questions?
So that's a very good point, right? And in fact, what we have been able to do in this last week, thanks to the work that Daniel Simon did, was incorporate the 2014 data from INCRE. So let's see what happens. So that those data were recently released. Daniel brought them in the data set, updated our calculations, and we did see some changes, but not significant, at least in terms of our confidence intervals with respect to EPA's point estimate. So yes, Daniel.
Go ahead.
So you're right. We are seeing reductions in SO2 emissions, right? And that we can see that in the 2014 data, but our estimates don't change that much. Another issue that's relevant here is, as you said, what's going to happen in the future. EPA's projections assume some reductions from CASPER, from the cross-state air pollutant rule, and you will see though that, these are the, yes. So the baseline for SO2 emissions starting at 2020, 2025 and 2030 is relatively constant. So any reductions in SO2 we are likely to see are all probably going to materialize by 2020. And that's depending on how CASPER plays out. In any case, that's a valid point, but I think the focus, what we're trying to bring across in the paper is that, sure, other things might be happening in the background that we do not account for. But let's focus on the impact of this specific policy holding everything else constant. And yes, there is room for including the discussions of what's going to happen in terms of abatement devices for SO2 and NOx. But again, the main thing we need to keep in mind is that the Clean Power Plan doesn't give any incentive for SO2 and NOx reductions, right? It targets specifically CO2. All this stuff we're getting comes as a bonus, just because we are reducing output, right? So that's why we're not that concerned about other things that are happening in the background, exactly because of the type of mitigation that the Clean Power Plan, or any carbon policy for that matter, motivates. That makes sense.
Daniel Simon, did you want to add?
I just want to add that it's important to remember that all of our estimates of reduction are being done relative to the baseline for 2030.
Exactly.
So the EPA projects, here's what's going to happen to SO2 or NOx reductions by 2030 if there's no plan. So all the other sorts of technological advancements and the other regulatory stuff that they're aware of now, like the cross-state stuff, is all already embedded in the 2030. So what we're hoping that the EPA projections and our projections show is the marginal effect of just the law on top of everything else that's already there. Does that make sense?
Dean.
This is going to be for Gustavo. You can put me on that.
Okay.
So this is from Gustavo. Hi, Gustavo. So here's his question. I'm just going to read it to you. You show that your methodology leads to similar estimations to the linear programming approach used by the EPA when we focus on CO2 emissions. Then you apply your methodology to other pollutants and find important differences. But this does not imply that your estimations for the co-pollutants are better than the EPA estimations. We can also conclude that your approach works for CO2 but generates biased estimates for the other co-pollutants. I think it would be great to explore why the two estimates differ and/or explain why your methodology is more reliable than the EPA's methodology. And I may add something. It wasn't clear to me what the EPA's methodology was. Maybe you could say something about that as you respond to this question.
So the EPA applies the IPM, the Integrated Planning Model, right? So this is a linear programming model, assumes perfect foresight, uses the parameters. Basically, the IPM takes the 15,000 power plants, engineering, energy generating units in the US, breaks them down to about 4,000 model plants, so assumes that plants that are similar to each other are modeled as the same, uses engineering estimates with respect to efficiency of pollution control devices, heat rate, so assigns specific coefficients for each of those elements that result in reductions of co-pollutants, and projects how plants will respond based on the thresholds and the constraints that are imposed by the Clean Power Plan. So this is sort of an engineering approach to what will happen in the future. What we are saying is we're trying to estimate elasticities for those co-pollutants, right? Using historical data. How does CO2 move with output? How does SO2 and NOx move with output? What is this co-pollutant elasticity for output, which is very important for the Clean Power Plan? And using those estimated elasticities and the uncertainty around them, we're trying to get to total reductions in emissions based on the projections that the EPA is making for output reduction. So that's the main difference in the two approaches, right? Ours is largely based on the empirical approach, on the historical trends of SO2 and NOx reductions from power plants, whereas the EPA's approach uses specific sort of engineer-derived coefficients for the different elements in the production of a power plant. So we go from a linear programming model to sort of a regression type of an approach that we're taking in this paper. So that's the main difference in the two approaches.
Why does EPA why have they been using this to an extent?
So that's a good question. I mean, that's the model they've been using for many regulations. So for CASPAR, for MATS, the mercury and air toxics rule, the cross-state air pollutant rule, and we could argue that in the cases of those regulations where there are a lot of ways where other technology plays a more important role, so for the mercury and air toxics rule, there are all sorts of abatement practices that power plants can take, the same for CASPAR, for the cross-state air pollutant rule that targets nitrous oxides and sulfur dioxide emissions. So the importance of this model perhaps is elevated for those types of policies, but for the Clean Power Plan, plants don't have many options to comply, right? It's basically reduction of output from coal plants, increase in output from gas and renewables. And in fact, that's where the legal case stands with the Clean Power Plan, in that it takes the decision away from the plants and into the regulator. Right? A plant cannot comply unless it, at the extreme case, shuts down. And that's one of the legal arguments that those 27 states are basing their case. Right? It's sort of an out-of-the-fence kind of compliance approach. And that's what's unique about the Clean Power Plan, and that's why we believe our approach works for this case and for other carbon policies.
So you had a follow-up, or you had a question of your own.
Yeah,
so hang on, but let me get David, I think, was in along with Gustavo, and I'll come back to you, Dean, and then I've got Claudia, and anybody else wants to get on the queue after that. Yeah.
So I guess a idea for you for pitching the paper, and then a question. So given that we're probably a matter of months away from the social cost of carbon no longer being allowed to be considered for regulation, you might have the ability to argue that even taking that off the table, we need to measure sort of the co-benefits from these Now there's controversy over allowing co-benefits to be included in estimation EPA as well, but that aside, just to give you an idea of what we might be able to do. So here's the question. So when and this maybe it's already in here, I'm just not seeing it or understanding exactly how you're doing your forecasting. But one of the big differences between the historical period you're looking at and moving forward is that the nature of the plants that exist are quite different. Right? We've had, over the last half dozen years, 250 or so old coal-fired power plants shut down. Right? And they're not going to reopen. Right? They've been replaced by natural gas. They've been, because of the cost of complying with the mercury statute, they're just offline. So I guess the question is, if those are being used when you're generating your estimates from the early period of time, how good of a foundation is that for then estimating the future?
So
Maybe Dan's response answered that. But
exactly. So that would be my response, right? So we are estimating the marginal change, assuming EPA's baseline in 2030 and the projected change. Okay, and you will see that if I go back here, right? Notice that the base case, right? So EPA's baseline scenario doesn't project a lot of reductions in coal. This is generation mix. So these are gigawatt hours produced from coal and natural gas. These are the two big players in the regulation, right? So you will notice that in 2020, 2025, and 2030, the baseline for coal generation is about the same. So absent the clean power plant, in the base case, we, at least starting at 2020, we're not going to see that much change in coal. You're right, there are no new coal plants being built right now, right? But again, what we are doing is we're estimating this marginal change given a reduction in output.
So I guess the question is, what does EPA assume in their models when they develop their base case about the composition of the power sector? Have they fully accounted for the fact that it's changed in dramatic ways? Because the plants that have come offline are the dirtiest. The biggest emitters of CO2, the biggest emitters of these other pollutants. I guess that's just a question that seems pretty important because it then goes to the nature of your estimates. Could they reflect the future?
So I think this gives you a sense, right, of what the EPA assumes. So it assumes more or less the same amount of coal generation, right, and a lot more generation coming from new gas plants. But definitely they do account for all the trends in the prices of the fuels, incorporating projections about fuel prices, gas and coal from the AEO, from EIA's AEO reports. So all that is accounted for in EPA's modeling.
So I think there's a couple of things that I would add. One is that EPA's projections have done their best to project what's going to happen in terms of coal plant shutdowns. Certainly, they've already incorporated the ones that have already shut down over the last 10 or 15 years, and they've certainly done their best here to project what's going to happen. So to the extent that that's all incorporated there, EPA is good, and the baseline that we're working from is good. The question is to what extent that our estimate's good. And there could be a problem to the extent that the plants that we're using are shutting down or are about to shut down and therefore are different from the ones that are going to be existing in the next 15 years. The best piece of evidence we can offer to suggest it's not a huge problem is that when we use only the later part of our data, only data from 2007 to 14 instead of going back to 2000, our results don't change dramatically. They do change, but that's the best we can do. There's going to be some additional compositional change that we can't capture beyond that. The best we can say is that when we only focus on the sort of second half of our data, we're at least trying to deal with some of the plant closing there for the change in composition. That's the best we can do right now.
Yeah, I think it's something you guys should think about because a lot of the closures are much more recent phenomenon over the last 5-6 years. Right?
I think, though, this is always a problem when you're estimating something using existing data and then trying to say something about what's going to happen in the future. It's a limitation that I think, though, at least in my mind, there's not too much more we can do besides take cuts of the most recent data So, but it's a real problem. I mean, it's a limitation.
Earlier we had,
Sorry, just to add, so this is what Daniel was referring to, right? So the different results using the full sample, dirtier plants, so plants that have a higher CO2 intensity, and newer data. So data starting at 2007 to 2012 and 2014 with the recent additions. And you see that there is a change in the elasticity with respect to output. And perhaps, based on what David suggests, perhaps we can truncate the newer data even higher, yeah, like starting at 2010, just to see as in a further additional robustness check to this elasticity. But that's a good point. Yeah.
all right, earlier we had Dean as Gustavo, now we have Dean as Dean, and then Claudia, and then if you want in on a few, let me know.
Could you put up that net benefits slide? That wasn't in the paper, was it?
No, that's just taken from the EPA. Yeah.
Just a quick point on the climate benefits to U.S. citizens or to
Global. These are global
air
climate
quality
benefits.
are to U.S. citizens.
Correct. Yes, that's correct.
That's kind of a fake table then.
Yeah, and that's
not ours.
and that's in the that was in the footnote of the RIA that I didn't include. Yeah, these are global CO2 benefits. Yeah,
I mean that should be at least distinguished.
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, they
But-
do mention that.
But my main question is, so you estimate emissions as a function of output and stuff.
Correct.
And I'm just wondering why you did that, and when you consider an alternative, as you estimate output, which is the profit maximizing decision of the firms, and maybe even the technology choice, and from that, because that's going to include prices, include regulatory changes, and compliance costs, enforcement, etc., and that's going to vary by state, some of that stuff. And from that, I mean, then from output, you just crank out what the emissions are, given a technology. Why would you? I'm just wondering if you're missing some economic forces here in these kind of estimates. And maybe I'm missing what you're doing. But.
And you're right, and I think that's something we briefly discuss right before we get into our results section in the paper. So we acknowledge that there could be some sort of endogeneity bias in the sense that those decisions are simultaneously made.
Well,
So
just thinking about the big changes in prices of natural gas, for example. I mean, there's some big things going on here that are going to change the whole mix of technologies and inputs, and then also the outputs you're going to choose. I'm just wondering if I'm not even sure which way it would go here, but I'm just wondering if the estimates are somehow biased by basically by omitted variables in a sense.
Again, as long as someone buys the argument that what we're interested here is the marginal change, given that things happen tomorrow, right? So within a year, this reduction in output, what will it mean for co-pollutants? So assuming this argument is persuasive enough, sure, we could argue how changes in prices will affect the trajectory of emissions.
With the prices and the technology, I'm thinking. I mean, I'm just, if you look at it a little differently and say, well, if we impose this new rule on standards and technologies and things, how will that change output, and how will it change the inputs used in that output? And then from there we get the emissions effect. Is your approach more or less equivalent, or where does it miss?
So we take EPA's output projection, right? So we assume that whatever EPA says, that's what's going to happen. Okay, so we are working off of this projection for output reduction. And we're saying, given this reduction in output, what will that mean for co-pollutant reductions, right? So this is about a 322,000 gigawatt hours in reduction from coal-fired generation, right? So assuming that that's going to happen, what will that mean for SO2 and NOx emissions? And the same for natural gas. So those two, there's opposing in directions, but overall there is a 69,000 gigawatt hours reduction in natural gas generation. So again, given those reductions, what's going to happen? We don't say anything about, there's nothing to be said from this approach about changes in output. We cannot project how output is going to change. And from that respect, we're not that concerned about forecasts of fuel prices because we are relying on those output changes that the EPA has estimated. And if we are planning to compare our results with EPA's results, we need to do that.
Both of your co-authors, I think, wanted in on this too.
No, go ahead.
So just another way to frame the results would be, instead of comparing the total number to the EPA's total number, we could convert the EPA's total number into a marginal effect,
Exactly, yeah.
and then just compare ours. Like we just take an elasticity coefficient and then multiply it by that total output.
Yep.
So we could just say, okay, assuming technology does not change, what's the impact of a marginal effect of 1 unit output reduction today? So it's the most useful for mass-based reductions instead of rate-based in the CPP or carbon tax. And then we're living just in that land. And then if things happen with technology or with rate-based and there's more natural gas online, we're not really able to say very much about those situations. So it's sort of, those highlight the limitations of our paper, but also about exactly what we're sort of able to discuss. It's just the co-pollution benefits from a marginal reduction given today's level of technologies and output.
But I would also say that that's the question where we set out to answer. That is, the EPA tells us this is how the plants are going to respond. So we could, I think a very reasonable alternative paper that someone could write is to say, how will firms respond to these regulations in terms of their output choice, in terms of their technology choice, given these potential changes in prices? That's a perfectly reasonable paper to write, but that's not the one that we're writing. The paper that we're writing is maybe taking a more limited question, which is, given how the EPA projects that the plants are going to respond to their output, what do we think is going to be the emissions outcome from it?
Claudia, next.
Nico, Dan, and Alex, very good paper. That's why I'm so proud to be your colleague.
That's a totally unbiased comment.
And I would like to hear more about the enforcing mechanisms. While it is true that the states are eligible to choose among any of the three approaches, yes? What are the enforcing mechanisms? And I know that you are using a state-level fixed effects that might take into account that. But still, what about if Alabama doesn't enforce CPP while there are other states that really enforce it?
And that's sort of the big question mark here, right? So you see that there are states that have 27 states that have sued the EPA even before, I think right after the rule was finalized. The Senate Majority Leader at the time published an op-ed urging states not to comply with the regulation. So the issue of enforcement is non-trivial here. So it sort of remains to be seen what's going to happen. We know that the future of the regulation is sort of bleak in a sense. So, but in terms of enforcement, and every state is allowed to come up with its own state implementation plan. If the state does not come up with such a plan, the EPA would have the authority to impose the federal implementation plan. Hence, there was a joke here: do your SIP so you don't get FIP'd. So design your own state implementation plan so you don't have to deal with the federal. So the question is, if the federal is implemented and there is a lack of compliance, how would the EPA enforce that? I mean, I don't know what kind of enforcing mechanisms there are there. But the idea is that we don't want to get there, right? We want to have buy-in from the states in order to implement this regulation. It appears that we don't have this buy-in. What I should note, however, just as an interesting side note here, is that even some states that have sued the EPA are still continuing to design their own state implementation plans. Some of the red states here have ceased any action on the Clean Power Plan. Others that have sued are still continuing to design their own implementation plan, and that's sort of an interesting sort of conundrum. So while you have this 27 states that are suing, 16 that are supporting, the breakdown in terms of continuing to implement versus suspending the plans is at 19-19. So 8 of those states are actually still working on how they would comply with their rule, even though they're suing.
Tom, next.
So 2 questions. The first one, this may be a really dumb question, but it's not my field, so I'm just going to go ahead and ask it.
No such thing as a dumb question, only a dumb answer.
So you compare this to like quote unquote engineering based solutions, and I wasn't quite methodologically what an engineering-based approach would be versus what you've done here, and so that's just a question for clarification. It's probably clear to people who are in the field, but I wasn't quite clear on it. And the second question is maybe a derivative of that, and that is there? It seems like if you're shutting down plants, there's, for the health impacts component of the project, there's potentially a spatial component in that if you shut down plants in one geographic region, it's going to have particular health footprint versus, it's not like CO2 where it goes into a global pool and there's a global impact. It's more of a localized geographic impact. And so can you just address the spatial component of the coal plant shutdown scenarios that you're examining and the extent to which that could be tuned or modified to maybe have, if you're reducing by X percent, but you differentially apply that reduction in this geographic area, could you have more of a health benefit than if you were to apply it homogeneously?
Very good point, both. Let me address the first question. An engineering type of model does the following. We have a heating plant here on campus. It uses coal, it uses natural gas, it has some baghouses that are trapping some of the particulate matter, it has some other pollution control devices. In an engineering-based model, all of those pollution control devices, the heat rate of the plant would be accounted for, and based on the assumption that those pollution control devices are there, and with whatever changes are going to happen in the future, that engineering-based model provides estimates of CO2 emissions, SO2 emissions, NOx emissions, accounting for changes in prices of the fuel, how in the future, well, it could be the case that in 5 years we will no longer have a coal boiler in our heating plant here and it will run 100% on natural gas. So these kinds of forecasts are accounted for in this type of engineering model. Again, with the assumption I mentioned earlier that out of the 15,000, we are grouping them into what the IPM calls model power plants.
So it's non-empirical in that it's not looking at this historical
exactly.
data.
It is deterministic and perfect foresight model. I know exactly what's going to happen in the future and what I say is going to happen. I cannot account for the type of uncertainty that we are trying to introduce here when we are sort of capturing those standard errors, right? So that's one of the contributions of our work, that we can sort of bound those point estimates as opposed to the EPA that says, this is it. 278,000 tons SO2 reduction, bound.
So you might call that like, I'll let you get to the second question. So you might like say your approach versus like a scenario-based approach, for example, because it seems like calling your model empirical and that analysis not empirical isn't quite appropriate, given that they're looking at empirical data in producing those outcomes. So that's a small thing. And maybe,
no, that's a good point. Yeah.
Maybe in the economics literature, that terminology is totally clear, and it's just I'm off base there. But
it is empirical in the sense that they are indeed using some of like 2012 data to get some of those coefficients and to calibrate the model. But the results are mainly driven by sort of these those projections and those forecasting approaches. The second question is absolutely something that we are working on, and with Alex's help, we've started looking into the health impacts of CO2 emissions reductions, and you're absolutely right. The geographic component here is very important, right? Reducing reducing SO2 and NOx by 1,000 tons in Wyoming has definitely fewer benefits than having the same reduction in New Jersey, right? So, in fact, we briefly mentioned in section 6 on the health effects that part of what we're planning to do is having a treatment for reduction of output based on which reduction at which location has the highest marginal benefit. So that's something we plan to explore, but you're absolutely right. And I believe the model we are using allows us to see how reductions in SO2 in one county affect that county as well as the rest of the US. Is that the right way to put it?
So we could feasibly do that right now.
Well, I apologize.
It's possible.
but you're not doing like atmospheric modeling where
It
you're
is.
looking at the flow.
That's all it.
Oh,
Yeah.
So you're running the model spatially, where you're turning on and off plants in like a Monte Carlo kind of simulation where?
For now, we've done it sort of purely deterministic. So we are taking all the plants, the coal plants, and we are starting to shut them down one by one. In the results we're reporting here, based on the dirtiest ones, the ones that have the highest CO2 intensity, we start shutting them down by state until we reach the state threshold. Then we move to the next state, But you're right, presumably there are many treatments that we can apply here.
Alex and Daniel in on this.
And
Dean wants in quickly on this point, and then I've got Bernie.
I can wait to answer. So for each plant that's selected in each one of those models, we then put it into an atmospheric transport model to figure out where they would go. Now, we're not doing the atmospheric transport model or the marginal damage estimates. We're relying on other people that have already done that research. Then we're saying, okay, because that plant's located in this area, it impacts more people. It is feasible to then say, okay, is that New Jersey plant impacting people in New York City and not people around here, and break it up that way? But that's much more complicated to do, and we can't rely on the simple aggregates that people have created. But that's feasible to do. If, for instance, a referee would want it. I don't know how much. That would take a couple hundred hours.
God forbid a geographer as a reviewer.
But we have
Unlikely to happen.
right now our estimate provides the aggregate to the whole U.S. from a marginal damage-based estimate that's that's on top of an atmospheric transport.
Got it, thanks.
I was just going to add that right now, this is something actually we'd be interested in getting any ideas from, is one of the things that in adding this health piece we've realized that we really don't know is which plants will be the ones that reduce their output or shut down in response to this. So we are currently considering 3 different scenarios for this. The first one is the one that Nikos just mentioned, where we assume that the dirtiest plants get shut down first. That is not the ones with the most emissions, but the highest emissions intensity. A second possibility that we're looking at is that they will shut the plants down with the lowest utilization factor. So the ones that are currently being run the least will be the ones that are the easiest for them to shut down. They'll shut down those first. We tried that as well. And the third one we use is we have estimates from Alex of the counties that have the highest marginal damages. So where pollution is the most costly, it does the most damage. We assume that plants in those counties will get shut down first. So we're trying each of those 3 scenarios, but we're open to trying other scenarios of which plants would get shut down first.
So super quickly, what you could do is, given the federal administration that we are living in now, you could look at the job impact of different places, which I think will have an influence on the order with which they start shutting these plants down, and that might be a way to actually make it more relevant.
Talk briefly, that came up, I thought, in our maybe, but anyway, that's a great idea.
But sorry, Tom, when you say the job impact, do you mean
shut down the ones with that would cost?
Like they're unlikely to shut stuff down in West Virginia, basically, because the political fallout from that would be so significant.
But the issue is that regardless of where the plants are shut down, coal miners in West Virginia will be affected anyway, right? So you're talking about the jobs specifically at the power plants.
Yeah, I guess you'd have to take into account the transport of coal from source to location.
You could just do it by unemployment rate. Like they don't shut them down, the most unemployed. I mean, it's like a
As a first cut,
nice.
that would get you there. All right, Dean, also on this point.
Well, my question was, given the potential big impact of where the plants are being shut down in terms of benefits, what's your sense, or is there any literature on how close to optimal is the EPA's policy in shutting down the plants that will generate the most benefits in health?
That's a good question. The one thing that
is the policy designed to do that? Probably not.
No, they leave it up to the state.
Exactly, yeah. And I mean, the idea is that the implementation happens at the state level, so each state is free to devise its own sort of menu of options that utilities are going to use to comply. Ideally, you want to apply the equimarginal principle and make sure that everybody operates at the same marginal abatement cost. And that's one limitation that we're having here. We're not talking at all about marginal abatement cost curves. Implicit in the IPM is information about cost, but I should say that I cannot give a very precise answer to this question. That would require sort of looking exactly into how the IPM, the linear programming model the EPA uses, models marginal abatement cost versus marginal damages. But that's a very good point.
We don't observe the EPA's model of which plants are getting shut down. So we don't know. That's part of our problem. So we're sort of hunting and pecking for other ideas here.
All right, next up is Bernie, then Ken, if you want in.
So Nikos,
Just let me
I'm going
know.
to ask it from a very different perspective. Since what you're talking about is local, with SO2 and NOx, you're really talking more local impacts rather than carbon, which is, global.
I would say regional impacts, right? Because it depends on like the stack
So-
height of a plant determines how far away those pollutants are
So
being
another
dispersed.
big EPA initiative is stormwater management. And some of the big metropolitan areas, rather than do a big dig where they build a big pipeline, big pipes to take care of stormwater, they're doing big tree planting initiatives, which ought to affect air pollution. And for instance, Philadelphia has decided not to do a big dig, and they're gonna plant like 5 million trees in the metropolitan area, not just in the city of Philadelphia.
To help with stormwater
So
management.
you got this,
Yeah.
you got this other EPA issue going on, and it might connect somehow with what you guys are talking about in terms of health, because the trees obviously make things healthier besides regarding stormwater. And I don't think this should be in this paper, but it's something you guys might take off and think about. And the big tree planting initiatives are, when they're really big, they're easy to figure out where they are. I mean, all you gotta do is do a little Googling, and New York's got a big one. There's a huge one in Philadelphia, and then other cities are saying, no, we're not gonna do that, or we're not worried about that.
So you can think of this as a broader full employment for policy modelers initiative, where they just start to
And so-
interconnect all of these.
Because you're trying to tie it to health.
Right.
And you're right, and Bernie makes
No,
a good point.
I think it is a good.
I'm not
Go
sure what the Clean Power Plan provides for offsets, right? Because the equivalent here would be, can a state comply by applying some offsets, carbon sequestration?
The only place that
I'm
they're
not
really
sure.
doing carbon offsets for urban tree planting in any big way is California. California's got a big initiative. That's the only one that I know of. They've got a carbon registry in California, and the urban tree planting fits in it. I don't know anywhere else that's connected, but in California it's big.
Ken.
So I'm hesitating to ask this next question because it's going to show the depths of my ignorance. But we haven't really talked about your two models on page 9. And I'm trying to figure out how some of the comments you've been making relate to these. So I'm hearing that you're using some of what EPA did, but then using it in a different way than they did. And as I look at this, we've got the emissions for coal plants is a function of output, heat rate, pollution controls, and various. And I'm wondering, well, wait a minute, but output itself is a function of the Clean Power Plan. And so I'm wondering, are you taking output, changes in output, changes in heat rate and so on, as EPA forecast them, and then rather than running them through an engineering model, you're running them through an empirical model? Am I understanding that correctly?
So what we are taking is all the output decisions that have happened in the time period of our study, right? So
Okay.
our data run from 1997 to 2012, recently to 2014. And IGRID doesn't have annual information, some years are skipped. So we track the historical decisions on output, how much has each plant generated in every year. That's what's on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, how much has each plant emitted over the different years.
So this is just a model. This is just a model of emissions versus variation that we've historically observed. This isn't from EPA.
Correct.
Then,
What we are taking from the EPA is after we've estimated this co-pollutant elasticity, we are saying now EPA says that in 2030 we're going to have 300,000 gigawatt hours less from coal power plants. Okay, assuming
So
that
output
this
changes.
assuming that this output changes happens, we use our elasticity on SO2 and NOx to see
So
how.
you're not trying to model how the firms will respond, but rather you're modeling the effect of their
Exactly.
response.
We are modeling the elasticity of the co-pollutants
I think,
with respect to output.
and I think that could be a little clearer in
Okay.
the discussion to bring that out.
Well, because that was Dean's question too.
Yes.
So, and I think it's a very reasonable paper for someone to write. It's just not the one we're writing, and maybe we need to make that more clear, though.
And that's all I'm saying, is it's taken me a while to figure out what you did do. I'm not saying you should have done something different. But
I think we need to make that clear.
So clarify that we are not in the business of forecasting output decisions or in any way modeling behavior in response to the clean power plan. That's absolutely right. Thank you very much, Ken.
But it also then helps to understand the importance of David's observation, which is this is a model of how historically the emissions from coal-fired power plants have responded to the changes in output and heat rate and so on.
Correct.
If that mix of coal-fired power plants is different today, then we have to account for that in interpreting our results. And I think that if you clarify that sort of step by step, the message becomes much stronger, or at least clearer.
I would like to add to that because I support what Ken just said and also give another example. This is on page 14, where just you can add, it might not take more than a sentence or two to increase the clarity of this. It says that the elasticities increase substantially for both SO2 and NOx when you use the more recent data, and you get higher elasticities based on more recent data than you do when you use the whole sample. A little further down on the same page, and I'm sure you're right. What I was looking for was apply. You know, I wanted to know the story of why do you think you get a higher elasticity estimate when you base on more recent data than on the whole period?
So the answer to that, and so this is what Bill is talking about, right? So the elasticity for SO2 for the full sample is at 0.6, right? So a 1 kilowatt hour, so like a 1% reduction in output results in a 0.6% reduction in SO2, right? But as we move to the newer data, that increases. So we have a higher reduction in SO2 for a reduction in output. And presumably that is happening because plants are becoming cleaner, right? So we're moving to a situation where CO2 intensity is decreasing, so a decrease in output results in a higher reduction in SO2.
So it's almost the opposite of the other story, which would have been because you've gotten big reductions in the past, you're going to get smaller reductions in the future. This is actually a technology of reduction is improving, and it's accelerating the rate.
And you can see that here, right? If we have,
okay.
sorry, and that sort of captures it. If you apply the newer data, so from 2007 to 2012, you get a higher reduction in SO2 compared to the full sample, compared to the number we get from looking at the entire sample.
Yeah, I just wanted to rephrase that in a slightly different way if it wasn't clear. So basically, when plants are more efficient, so they're emitting less CO2 per unit, when you regulate a mass amount of CO2, you get more, you remove more SO2, right? So it's, I think maybe, I don't think we make that clear.
No, but that's a good point.
And like I said, I don't think it would take more than a sentence or two, but just
it's a subtle
I
point.
wanted the story. I wanted the why part there. Okay. All right. We have come to the end of the queue. We have a few minutes remaining for summation, but one last call for any other questions or comments.
What do you think is actually going to happen to the clean power plant?
So I think, and that's conjecture, I think the administration is just going to let the courts do their thing. They're going to let it play out. I don't think that they want to go into the business of proposing something else that will replace it or make the argument that it imposes a substantially high cost for plants. I think they're just going to let it play out in the DC Circuit Court. Maybe it'll go up to the Supreme Court. And given what we're seeing with the new sort of structure of the Supreme Court, they might anticipate what they will see as a positive decision. So what I suspect is going to happen is we're going to let it play out through the courts and eventually either being struck down completely or returned to the EPA for modifications, similar to what we saw with MATS, right? Under the sort of, and again, that's sort of one could say that there was an overreach on the part of the EPA, right? So this argument of beyond the fence changes, I mean, I'm no legal scholar, but I can see how opponents of the rule can play into this argument. You're asking for compliance that goes beyond the capabilities of a power plant. A coal power plant, what can they do? Can you ask them to shut down? That's...
Could it happen? I'm just thinking out loud here. I don't know if anyone has a better read on this. But could it happen that you look at it as either the states win or the federal government wins at the appellate court level? If the states win, the federal government won't appeal. If the federal government wins, then the federal government will decline to defend when it goes up to the Supreme Court. And in either way, it's doomed.
Yeah, that could be.
There may even be a procedural issue, which would be if the feds win, then the feds can't appeal a decision they won.
No, but if the states appeal it, the feds would decline to.
Yeah. But that's an interesting thing if all the states sort of stepped back and said, you won. I don't think that's going to happen.
You caught the car. What are you going to do with it now? Right.
And then it leaves open the question of, well, what do we do with Massachusetts v. EPA?
Exactly. Yeah.
If this isn't it, how does the federal government deal with the fact that we still have Massachusetts v. EPA that says you got to do something?
And in fact, one of the treatments we want to do is we have this idea of just saying, okay, let's say the red states do nothing. What happens if only the blue states comply and with their goals? What is going to be the difference in health benefits if only those blue states proceed with implementation versus if everybody proceeds in implementation? And that could give us sort of some estimate of the cost of not pushing the ball forward.
Alex, help me on this. Are NOx reduction benefits more local? SOx is more, SO2 is more regional and kind of east of the emissions.
So yeah, it totally depends on the stack height though. So for instance, in the Yavapai plant in northern Arizona, but it has like a 400-foot stack height, and it'll impact LA, right? So, but no NOx local. And in Chicago, NOx reductions are actually a net bad because it interacts with VOCs in a weird way. So it totally depends. But yes,
the chemistry
broadly, what you're saying is correct.
Yeah.
I'm just curious too, really quick, just in this kind of future of Paris, right? Are there any lessons here for other countries that are pursuing a more administrative route, like the U.S. has so far, to their own national pledges? I'm not sure that you guys have looked at that, but I just didn't know, just commented if that's something you're interested in.
Lessons for other countries in what sense?
Well, so I don't know how many are pursuing this more administrative route toward reducing their own emissions. My guess is most are pursuing more kind of traditional laws and policies. I could be wrong about that, but I didn't know if there might be some takeaways.
The whole sort of climate change policy issue is very interesting, right? And it captures. Lindstrom has this very interesting work on the polycentric approach to climate change policy, and she brings out exactly those kinds of arguments that we're not going to have. We should not wait for the decision to come from the top. We should start from the bottom up, and we have seen those cases, right? California has its own cap and trade system. The RGGI states, the New England states have their own regional greenhouse gas initiative. There's the C40 initiative with different cities implementing climate change initiatives. So we have things moving at different levels of governance. The benefit of this approach is that it sets the signal, right? It gives a stronger signal of what's going to happen in the future. That is the decision coming from the top. But definitely that doesn't mean that we should wait until things get resolved from the top, and the legal challenges that the Clean Power Plan is facing are capturing sort of this risk, the risk of waiting for a national policy. So Paris sort of helped in that sense, but it remains to be seen what's going to happen with compliance. But definitely, sort of the lesson that comes from the Ostrom workshop, I believe, should be one of a polycentric approach, right? We can do things at different levels of governance. It's just that it would be great if we could have a carbon tax. I mean, if we could have a price for carbon. In the absence of that, let's try to do things at different levels.
You have a couple of minutes left to sum up.
Thank you, folks, very much. I wrote down several very, very good points. So David's point about the social cost of carbon potentially going away in the future, that's something we should highlight in the paper. Tom's point about the job impacts, I really like that idea, and focusing on the spatial importance of output reduction. Dean's point about how does EPA model power plant closures, that's something that we can address in the paper. Discussion about offsets, a very good point by Bernie. And the two clarification points that Ken and Bill mentioned, as well as Claudia's comment about sort of the issue of enforcement. These are all things that I think will definitely improve the paper. Again, I really appreciate you taking the time to read this paper, and I know that it's not sort of the usual paper we kind of see in this workshop, and that's because my work is more on the quantitative aspect of things. So again, I really appreciate the feedback, and I hope to be able to incorporate all of that in the new version of the paper. Thank you, folks.